Welcome to another episode of Framlingham College in Conversation. I'm here today with Emmeline Gwaspari, clinical psychologist, Emily and Amy. This is part of our series on wellbeing, and today we're going to be talking about stress. Yeah, I think today we've got a number of questions that we've come up with around stress that hopefully will give our listeners a good insight into how to cope with it, maybe, what's normal, what's not normal, when to get help, and what this word actually means. Because let's face it, everyone talks about stress in the 21st century, but shall we start with that? What actually is stress, Emmy?
I wonder whether we ought to start by having a bit of a disclaimer, because actually when we talk about stress, it might evoke quite different feelings in whoever's listening to the podcast too.
Yeah.
And, somebody might also realise they're more stressed than they thought they were, or, it might just really resonate with them. So I think we ought to just acknowledge that before we start.
Absolutely.
So what is stress is a great question, isn't it? I don't know that there's a really clear definition out there. I was trying to look because I have a good sense of what stress is myself. But I thought, what is the real definition? And there's really mixed views about it, whether there's a really definite kind of way to describe it. But I guess, what is our thought about stress? How would we all describe stress in the room?
Well, I don't think I have a definition to give you. It's more of a feeling for me, because I think I feel stress very physically. It affects, how it's your hands, and you're getting all worked up a little bit, and I think it affects how you think and how you're feeling in every day, and how you...
So that's the impact, isn't it? And I think we're all really good at thinking about how do we maybe notice it, or what's the impact. So what is it though? Because stress isn't always a really bad thing, because some stress is actually really good for us. I always have a positive spin on things somewhere, don't I?
Absolutely.
So if we kind of think about stress, really, in essence, is about us responding to a threat or a sense of pressure, or a barrier maybe even, whether that's like a physical one or a psychological barrier to something. So it's kind of our body and our brain's way of kind of responding to that, isn't it? So if you kind of think about it, if you were faced with a real life threat of like a dangerous animal coming towards you, then, that stress would be a really good stress to have, wouldn't it? Because we wouldn't want to kind of sit there and go, oh, that looks quite cute. We'd want our kind of body and brain to get into action to kind of survive it. So that's a really genuine threat, isn't it? But I think the thing about kind of threats is, in modern society, it's really changed, hasn't it? So it can be something that happens in your family, can be something that happens when you're walking down the road, can be, your own kind of perception and your own thoughts about something, or the pressures you put yourself under sometimes, or the expectations we place on ourselves. So it can be so varied what can cause a stress for somebody, I think, in this day and age.
Yeah, so that, from the readings that I've done, it sounds like, what you're saying there is it's this idea that, how stress manifests in us is that as humans, in yesteryear, we're not fighting saber-toothed tigers anymore. We used to be. Now we're not. But we still have this fight, flight, or freeze response system.
Absolutely.
That kicks in when we feel stressed. But the causes of stress are no longer saber-toothed tigers. Well, not often in my case.
Not real ones, generally.
But we still react in the same way to things that frighten us, that spike our fear. Does that sound?
Absolutely. And I think some of our previous experiences, can also influence how we respond to something. So we might kind of have the same experience, but I might be quite calm about it, and you might have a threat response to it. Yeah. Not that I'm saying that way around necessarily.
No, that's fine. It's probably true.
So, but it just kind of varies how we respond and how we react. I think, to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
So and then what Amy kind of nicely talks about is that, that response we have. So we might have responses to a stress situation or build up of stress in terms of kind of how we think about it. So, maybe if you think about, it's exam season coming up, or is happening already, isn't it? One or the other. Can't quite work it out. But, exam season, that stress builds up, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we kind of often have those thoughts of, I can't do this. I can't get through this. Am I good enough? I'm not as good as Tom over there, or,
Yeah.
And we have all those comparisons. So there's a lot of thoughts that happen. And then kind of Amy talked very nicely about some of the physiological responses that happen, don't they? So we have those kind of maybe churning stomachs. We have, that sort of feeling really hot, feeling really tense, feeling headaches. You often have lots of headaches, struggle eating. So it has like a whole ripple effect, doesn't it?
And are those physical manifestations back to my saber-toothed tiger friend in that your body is preparing to flee, essentially?
Yeah.
So your adrenaline pumps, and that makes you sweat.
So you've got your adrenaline, your cortisol,
your tummy goes because you're ready to run at the fastest pace you can, and all the rest of it. So all those symptoms are actually quite normal for us to experience, perhaps.
They are. So, and actually the reality, the things we would think about are kind of thoughts, so how we make sense of something, how we respond physiologically, what we do about it as well, and then the feelings that we notice in ourselves. So you might feel anxiety, you might feel a bit low, you might feel all sorts of different emotions coupled in with that as well.
Yeah, okay. So it's not always as clear cut, is it, as if I'm stressed, I feel this, or if somebody else is stressed, they feel that. Everyone manifests their stress in different ways, physically, internally, mentally.
Absolutely. So it can be really individualised how somebody experiences stress.
I think that can also make it a lot more difficult, because it's not like diagnosing a physical condition where you can just sit there and go, this is what you should feel, and kind of thing.
Absolutely. And what we do kind of really varies, doesn't it? So some of us will kind of not eat at all when we're really stressed, which isn't very helpful to that either. And some of us will eat rather a lot in that period of time, and probably not very nutritionally helpfully either. That's a really bad expression, isn't it? Nutritionally healthy.
Made sense to me.
So, but the bit to hold in mind is that without stress, we don't function very well either. So if we kind of think about, if I said to you, Amy, you've got this essay to write on flowers, where would that leave you?
Well, if you didn't tell me when I had to do it, then I'd probably be like, they'd probably go to the back.
Absolutely. So you'd not feel very motivated to do anything with it, potentially. You might have those that get really stressed out about it, but often we kind of, if we don't have a priority about something, or kind of a sense of pressure attached to something, we kind of put it to the back. We kind of, put it on the back burner, don't we? So we need a little bit of that pressure. So if I said to you, I really want this essay by next week, so by Thursday at 4:00, I really need to see this essay.
Yeah, that's quite a lot more stressful than an open-ended timeline.
Okay, but that puts a little bit of pressure on. Yeah. Assuming you haven't got a load of other work going on. Okay. Yeah. So assuming that, then, that puts a bit of pressure. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what happens with that little bit of pressure?
Well, the more you think about it, it builds up. Especially, or if that's suddenly like other things get in the way, you've got more deadlines to have. And
we'll go to that in a minute. So let's just assume you've got this essay next week, and it feels doable. A little bit of pressured, but nothing too major.
You're probably not too worried about it.
Yeah.
Maybe leave it ever so slightly to the last minute, potentially.
Okay. So we're all different on that, but you'd kind of get a level of motivation to get the task done by the Thursday, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So that's where a little bit of that stress and pressure kind of is helpful. So we kind of know that having no sense of pressure means we don't get often anything done. Having a bit of pressure and a bit of that stress activates us into kind of doing something. Okay. So, and if it's in our reach, we feel really productive. Okay, so ideally you have a bit of pressure, but not too much, and that kind of equals a good level of productivity in essence. So what then happens though, if I said, you've got that essay on Thursday by 4, I also want that other essay by 5:00 on Friday, and don't forget that kind of other thing we talked about on Tuesday, and you've got Shrek performance in the middle of it, how are you going to feel?
a lot more stressed. Yeah.
Okay. So, and actually, realistically, you might not feel that's in your reach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you might start with one of those and you might achieve it, or you might just be totally overwhelmed by thinking about all of those different things, right?
Yeah.
So what does that do to our productivity at that point?
You're much less productive because you're spending your time actually just worrying about the stuff that you've got to do.
Absolutely. So if I then just carry on by topping things on top of that, we burn out. So if that just happens over a prolonged period of time, if you're too overwhelmed and it feels totally unmanageable, that's when it affects our functioning, doesn't it?
Definitely.
You know, and then what happens? What happens in terms of our well-being? What happens to our sleep?
Definitely disrupted because you're still thinking about it, even if you're still thinking about the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
I think I can definitely relate to that occasionally. And I think it's still the same. It just affects you in everything. It becomes what you think about all the time, or even if you've got one thing done, you're not happy you've got that done because you've got all this other stuff to do as well.
Yeah.
So I think it can definitely build up, and I think it gets to the point where, like, if you're up here anyway, if you're up high with the stress levels, a little tiny thing can push you over, rather than if you're at the bottom and it's kind of like, okay, I can deal with this if you put something else on.
Yeah.
So it makes everything a bit less manageable in every day.
Okay. So it has a ripple effect, doesn't it? Or a domino effect, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
So, you know, feeling that really high level of stress impacts your sleeping. So if you don't sleep, that impacts your amygdala. So it means that we're kind of going to be much more sensitive emotionally because we haven't recharged it, in essence. We haven't kind of soothed ourselves and really kind of re-energized overnight. So that leaves us feeling a little bit more vulnerable, in fact. So that's going to add to the stress, isn't it? So then if we don't eat very well, either we don't eat at all or we eat a whole load of chocolate and sweets and all those sort of things because, you know, or something really quick rather than the thing that maybe we'd normally eat, what happens then? So what would happen if we don't eat? Because that happens to some, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, you're gonna negatively impact your physical health as well as your mental, and when both of them are down, it makes it much more difficult to balance your emotions because you're dealing with all the physical and the psychological.
Yeah. So sort of thinking about exam stress time, those that kind of spend a long time just revising, they've forgotten to eat for 4 hours.
Yeah.
Or maybe longer. You know, you see all sorts of extremes, don't you? So what happens? Our blood glucose levels drop quite significantly if we don't look after our sort of nutritional side of things, doesn't it? So, and then that has a further impact on our ability to concentrate, pay attention, focus. So we kind of think we're sometimes doing the right things by, let's just get our head down and keep kind of, you know, revising and doing all these things. Or, you know, if you're in a working role, that other thing, I'm just going to plough on for that next hour and it's 2-3 hours later.
It's always a bit counterproductive.
It is. And I think that's the key. So what we find ourselves in is something called, so there's kind of a 3-system kind of model, which is quite nice to think about. So there's the threat system, which is what we've talked about with this saber-toothed tiger that you mentioned earlier.
My old friend.
Your little friend. So, you know, which is natural, and a bit of that's good. There's then the drive kind of component. So the drive component's great because what it does is it gives us a sense of achievement on the whole. So you achieve something, what happens? What happens, Emily? If we achieve something, how do we feel?
Feel great.
Feel great, exactly, because the dopamine gets released, doesn't it? So we feel really good in that moment. Now, the danger is both of those systems are doing systems. So, and if you kind of respond to the threat in a drive way, so you kind of get so driven in response to the threat that you face, it can also become problematic. Because you might be the one that revises 12, 13 hours a day. Now, hopefully I won't get it in the neck for saying that here. But, you know, we'll talk a bit about how to balance it in a minute. So, but that's not going to be productive. And we know, research shows us that's not a productive way to do it. Now, if you're kind of doing something you get a lot of enjoyment from, that, you know, isn't totally tunnel visioned, that's great because it gives you a balance. So those are all kind of very kind of doing things. So that those two systems. So that's what they do. They kind of get us into action, don't they? So, but what happens if we're kind of too much in action? That's when we get too stressed, too burnt out, we feel overwhelmed. We don't always feel great about ourselves. If that's a short-term thing, fine. But if it's that goes on for a really long time, that becomes problematic.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting with the drives and things. I think sometimes even when you set yourself tasks to do every day, it's almost as if you finish that, it's like, oh, okay, but maybe I could add some more to this, and maybe I could do some more. And then over time, you're spiraling, and then it is going to get to like 12, 13 hours a day. Yeah. And I think the thing about that is in the short term, you might feel, well, I'm being very productive, I'm getting lots done. But then eventually you are going to hit that brick wall and that burnout because your body just can't sustain it.
So in the short term, that's okay. Yeah. So holding that in mind, isn't it? And I think we've all done that version. I definitely have. And I quite often, not a good example, come up with a lot of my ideas in my sleep. So that's not helpful. Indicates I haven't slept well that night. So we all fall into those traps, and we all fall into those kind of rhythms, really, don't we? Now, what we have to think about is how do we balance it out so we don't reach the point of burnout, because actually nobody's immune to burnout. So that's a possibility for anybody, unless we kind of keep a really good balance. Now, and the balance comes in the soothe system. So the soothe system is about having a sense of care for ourselves, isn't it? About deactivating a little bit, having a bit of that calm down, that kind of calming down kind of space, that sort of re-energizing kind of space in ourselves, isn't it? So now we all might do that really differently, but that is about not doing or doing something that really helps you chill out, in essence. That's a very professional term, isn't it, for the afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, so I've heard about it in terms of so you've got your stress response system, and then the sort of the opposite to that is your relaxation response system, which is sort of segues quite nicely into us talking about what we can do to reduce stress or manage our stress.
And stress can feel really toxic, can't it?
Oh.
Yeah.
So this is like really key. So there's a few kind of things we can talk about. So we can think about the soothing system and what might help us each soothe ourselves.
Yeah.
And obviously there are some sort of strategies you can talk about. So, you can think about mindfulness, relaxation, all of those things that we know are designed to kind of reduce that stress response in our bodies. But there's also obviously people have heard about the 5 pillars of wellbeing. We could talk about those. Or we could talk about the Wellbeing Abacus, which has 7 in it this afternoon. So there's lots of different ways to talk about what can we do for well-being or to soothe ourselves.
Yeah, I guess what I'd just like to mention before we dive into that is that sometimes I think that even when you are thinking about that soothing kind of what you're doing with yourself, it's kind of, you can almost, that guilt comes in. It's kind of, should I be using this time more productively? But I guess through what I've been reading, it's quite clear that actually spending that time with yourself is more productive, actually, in a certain sense. You've got to have that balance. Otherwise, it can spiral. But I think sometimes if you're spending that soothe time, but you're doing it in a way that you're still stressing yourself out with that guilt, it's not actually soothing at all. And you end up going further into that burnout because you're sat there worrying, and actually you're spending all this time sitting around and you're like, well, why aren't I feeling better already?
Yeah.
So I think it can definitely, it's about like tapping into that. You're allowed to chill out a bit.
Absolutely. And I think that is the toughest bit, isn't it? And you described that so nicely, Amy, because what you're saying is actually the toughest bit is letting our minds off the hook and being self-compassionate enough to allow ourselves that space. And there's that sense of guilt. There's a bit of that sense of shame if we're not managing either, almost, isn't there? And they're really difficult emotions and feelings to kind of manage. So I think the first step is about saying, actually, I do matter. You know, you wouldn't drive a car on empty. So if we reach the point of my fuel tank is empty, what am I going to achieve?
Literally nothing.
Absolutely nothing. So we've got to think about our well-being like a fuel tank. So if you've got enough kind of fuel in your engine, we can go, we can do things. So, but I've still got to stop on the way home to get my diesel. I literally do. You know, because otherwise I won't get home today. Yeah. You know, so it's a necessity for us. So it's not about seeing it as a luxury. This is about really looking after yourself and valuing yourself enough to do that. Now, the first thing that goes when we feel the pressure is exactly that. Mm-hmm. So if we kind of in the room think about, and it might be different, think about something that you feel really helps you replenish and refuel, that you really enjoy, just one thing that you really enjoy. It can be absolutely anything. What would we say? If you're happy to share it in the room.
Well, I think it's changed a little bit at the moment because I take A-level art.
Okay.
But normally painting is what chills me out. At the moment, slightly more stressful. But normally, when you don't have that pressure and you're just allowed to just flow and do it as you please kind of thing, I think it's very relaxing.
Okay, so normally you do some artwork or painting. Lovely, nice example. What about you, Emily?
Yeah, I'm quite big on running and kind of doing more physical stuff.
Yeah, great.
Even if it's just getting out for a walk, or I normally just do it without my headphones, just to really, like, if I'm feeling quite stressed, I can just take a break from everything and just just be with myself for a little bit.
Yeah, and that's also a great thing to do for managing those stress hormones in our body, isn't it? So it really rebalances, unless you're going running for like literally 12 hours flat. Oh, God, no. Just putting it out there because people can take it to extremes equally and then it can become stressful.
Yeah.
So what about you, Mr. Lloyd? Put you in the hot seat.
Yeah, a bit like Emily, really. I physical. I like to sort of let off steam physically on my Peloton bike quite regularly. I meditate actually quite a lot, and I do yoga every morning. So those are kind of three things. Nice. And then in the holidays when I'm not being a teacher, I surf, and actually that is the thing that really that's my self-soothe. It's like a rebirth every time you enter the water, submerge yourself and ride a wave, which is actually, for those who don't know, a Zen experience, because you can only be in that one moment when you're riding that wave. You're thinking of absolutely nothing else, which is a meditation essentially.
That's fab examples. Look at that. So really different examples in the room, isn't there? So what do? Well, I quite like. Well, I just feel otherwise I'll put you all in the deep end and don't say anything myself. So what do? I like to crochet or do something craft based. So I like making cards or sewing, but crochet is my thing at the moment. I love connecting with my family, so I have children and I like spending time with them, and also connecting with friends. I think just some examples. I can probably think of lots more.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to pinpoint one thing because I think sometimes
that's good.
In different moments you need different things. It's if I'm completely chaotically stressed out and tired, I'm not going to pick up my paintbrush. I'm more likely to go and sit, I don't know, with my mum and have a chat or watch some TV. Like, I've seen Friends about 4 times over. So it's kind of like you find those little comfort things that you love doing and it becomes less of I don't know, it's just a way to chill out.
We were talking just before the podcast, weren't we, about whether or not how you deal with stress can potentially be quite gendered. You know, do men deal with stress differently from women? And is that a thing? I mean, traditionally, all the research says that men don't feel very confident talking about their feelings, and therefore, you know, men suffer in silence, kind of thing, and women are more likely to go and have a conversation with somebody about it. I mean, is that true? I mean, is that in your experience?
It's a good question,
have you seen
isn't
that?
it?
Or is that just one of those stereotypical myths out there.
I have had probably more males sort of say that's much tougher to do, to come and talk about their difficulties. Yeah. And I think sort of descriptions have been, we're kind of taught not to do that almost.
Yeah.
We have to manage, we have to be cool, and that's just not cool.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the research, I'll own that one. So, but that is my clinical experience.
Yeah.
But again, I think that varies. But I guess, sometimes people are more willing to talk about things, whereas others feel there's a shame attached to that. Whereas actually one of the key bits about being stressed is about saying that to somebody, telling somebody that you're feeling stressed, because somebody might be able to help you reduce that stress, mightn't they?
Yeah, and shame's come up a couple of times now. That's quite an interesting one, that people are actually, they feel shame or they feel embarrassed, I suppose, about being stressed, that idea that, well, I should be able to cope, I should be able to manage, and then you kind of beat yourself up that you maybe can't, and is there something wrong with you, and do other people see that? And that's quite an interesting one, that often people don't talk, you don't talk about that around stress. Conversations around stress very rarely talk about that idea of shame. So that's quite an interesting one, actually.
I think it is a really interesting one, because stress can be such a natural part of everyday life. So actually, we should all be talking about it, shouldn't we? Yeah. And yet, some aspects of stress, people feel too ashamed to talk about, especially if they're struggling to manage and to cope.
Yeah.
So, and what do you then do with that? Well, so-and-so over there seems to be managing okay.
Yeah.
We don't really know that. We don't know what happens inside their head or, inside their bodies. We don't, do we? But 100%. We make the assumption that everybody else is doing okay. So then we kind of question ourselves of, well, why am I not doing okay? What's so different about me?
Absolutely.
What's wrong with me? Or, so there's a lot of internal judgment that happens.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it?
So I think that's quite key, isn't it?
Yeah, I think definitely once you open that conversation with someone, you do almost realise that quite a lot of the time, maybe not to the same extent, but they're still feeling the same kind of stress as you are, especially when we're going into exam season now. Mm-hmm. I feel that it's quite easy to see on the surface that some people might be okay and some people weren't, but you don't know how people deal with things. And sometimes I think if you talk about it and you realise that other people are feeling the same as you feel a little bit less shame, because it's kind of like, okay, definitely. It's actually all right that I feel like this.
But how do we know that you're not the only one to feel that way?
Yeah, no, exactly.
How do we know it?
Well, that's it. And it's always being mindful of the fact that you never know what other people are going through.
But I guess talking about it's one way of finding out, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And talking about it also might make somebody else feel better about their own feelings.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I think Brené Brown talks about it sort of chopping at the knees, or you're really reducing that kind of sense of shame.
Yeah.
So it is really important for us to talk about stress and to acknowledge actually sometimes that is normal.
So we've talked about all the stuff you can do for stress, like the physical, but what more can you do for it?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So somebody I know called Dr. Mosley came up with a wellbeing abacus, and that's all about how do we maintain our well-being generally. And I guess kind of what we've got to focus on when we've got stress is how do we rebalance. Now, the balance doesn't have to be perfect, because that's quite hard to achieve, isn't it? So if we think about the threat and the drive and then the soothing, if you wanted to balance that out, you're not going to get it perfectly all of the time, okay? So it's the same with well-being. We talked a little bit about the knock-on effect of things on our sleep, on our eating, for example. So those are the kind of things we want to think about. So there's 7 kind of elements. I don't think she calls it elements, but 7 aspects to this wellbeing abacus. So the first one we know for our wellbeing is connection. So if you've got people around you, and it can be anybody, it can be friends, can be teachers, can be parents, can be an aunt or your neighbour, could be absolutely anybody. But if you have a sense of connection, what does that make us feel?
More comfortable just to go and speak to them whenever you need to.
Maybe, yeah. So if you're stressed, it might be somebody you go and talk to. Or there might be friends where you don't go and talk about it, but you do such fun things, you have a good laugh, or do kind of things that, maybe a bit silly or, fun or whatever, that just makes you feel better.
Less isolated.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like isolation is like a big thing with it, because like sometimes you're so stressed out that you just don't have the energy to go and like see people. But then if you're isolated, it just makes it so much worse.
So what happens though, if you feel like that and you push yourself to have a coffee with a friend or something anyway, even if it was for half an hour?
I mean, it might take a lot for some people, but after you'll feel like that sense of, oh, like I actually kind of needed that. It gave me a bit of a distraction instead of just sitting in my room and doing nothing.
So it's the thing that makes us feel a little bit re-energized, refueled, like that fuel tank we were talking about. So if it's something that we really enjoy, if it's something we don't enjoy, that's a bit more challenging, of course. So holding that in mind, but we know that having good connections also gives you that space to talk about things, or just that nice distraction and that fun time, that feel good, that sense that you belong somewhere as well. Because if we're sort of sat in our rooms revising for a long, long time, we can feel really disconnected. We can feel really lonely in that sense of, I just can't get that in my head and remember that bit. I remember that really well. So just taking a break and having a little bit of that connection with somebody, whether that's you're WhatsApping somebody, you're kind of, doing whatever it might be, or you physically go out and meet a friend for a quick run for half an hour or whatever that might be. It's really helpful. So research also shows us that that is a really good indicator for our well-being in general. So, so try and factor some of those things in, because those are some of the things that go as soon as you get busy. So the next one is physical. So what do we do physically? We've talked a little bit about that. We've talked about exercise and the importance of releasing those sort of stress hormones and kind of rebalancing things that way. That's one way you've talked about, Emily, isn't it? Which you say is really helpful sometimes, but it's just one way. So what does kind of exercise do for us?
Releases endorphins.
Well done, Mr. Lloyd.
Hey, top of the class.
Top marks. Yes. Absolutely. And what do those endorphins do?
Make us feel happy.
Yeah. So it can be a real push to get ourselves to go out and do something like that, though, can't it?
It can.
Yeah. So sometimes we might be like, I am too tired for this. And your usual hour run that you might have might not be the thing you're going to go and do. But even if you did 5 minutes or 10 minutes of, I don't know, dancing around your room to kind of some music in your room or whatever, what does that do? It does the same thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that it doesn't have to be, you assume that exercise you have to be doing for at least an hour or with, maximum intensity or something like that. But it's even just that moving of your body, like even in yoga, like I've got quite into doing that. Yeah. And it's just the relaxation of just moving.
We'll come to that one, Amy. We'll come to that one. But it is about getting that kind of body moving. And Karen Traceman, in her training that I attended, she was literally like getting everybody to shake it out. And we all did that for a few minutes and we've all felt incredibly silly. But it's incredible just what those few minutes can do just by getting off your chair and physically just moving. It does make us feel good, because sitting on a chair for the whole day, I do it in my day job sometimes, it's not very nice. So then sleep. We've talked about sleep already, so that's the third one. That sort of makes our kind of whole emotion sort of part of the brain much more sensitive. We become a lot more grouchy. We notice that anyway, even without being stressed, really. But it is about having a good bedtime routine. That sounds a bit like we've gone to primary school. Sorry for that. But it is about kind of ensuring we have a good routine about it. So, we have a reasonably regular time. Maybe we do some things that kind of unwind us and relax us before as much as possible. If you're busy cramming in your kind of, last bit of revision before you go to sleep, what's going to happen?
You'll be thinking about that and what you haven't done.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would say it's about trying to kind of unwind as much as possible in whatever way that might be for you. Some people might like a nice bath, some people might just kind of read a book, that's quite chilled out. People do different things. And obviously if you're drinking, your caffeinated drinks like your coffee and your Coke at, 6 o'clock at night, it's going to probably not be so helpful really. But, they're just a couple of very basic kind of thoughts around that without going into whole talk about sleep.
Yeah, I mean, I recently started using on the iPhone. There's a sleep reminder. You can set it so that it reminds you sort of half an hour before, to sort of go into that routine. And I found that really useful, actually, so that's one thing. And I find that ruminating, if you're lying awake thinking, which to be honest, I sleep very well, it doesn't happen very often, but I get up, because otherwise you lie there ruminating. I get up and I do a 20-minute meditation, and then I go back to sleep really easily.
That's a good tip.
Because something that I always do is I'll be thinking about my next day. Or what I've got to do, or sometimes I'll actually be thinking of ideas for something I've got to write. If I've got, like, the latest thing was my sister's birthday card. I don't know why, I was just sat there thinking about that, but it's kind of, I think for me, I have to write it down.
Yeah.
So I get up and I write down everything that's in my head, and then suddenly it feels like, okay, well, if I go to sleep now, I'm still going to have that there tomorrow morning, rather than...
Some people put a little notepad next to their bed.
Yeah.
And just jot a few things down as they come into your head, and you feel you can't get rid of them. Mm-hmm. So some people keep a little notepad next to their bed and do that. So there's lots we could say about it. So what's my next one? Nutrition. We've talked about that already. Mm-hmm. So that's the fourth one. I won't talk about that too much because we've already talked about that. But the importance of having that balance, and we're not talking lunch and tea. It is important to have regular kind of nutrition. Because you can have quick sugar bursts, but they don't last very long, do they?
No.
And we're all guilty of those, just to put it out there.
Sure.
And I'm sure we all fall into that at times. So the next one, so number 5, is taking notice. So taking notice is a bit of what we talked about earlier. And you've talked about we've talked about meditation in the room. So taking notice, what happens in everyday life? We go into autopilot, don't we? Oh. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say it takes you out of your head. So if you get stuck in your own head, ruminating your thoughts, by looking up at a leaf falling from a tree.
Oh, beautiful.
You're taking notice of something that's outside of your mind.
And why would we want to do that, though?
Well, I think for me, it's that feeling of that there's something bigger than what's going on for you, because I think, or something more, there is those little beautiful things. Because for me, it's a sunset. I love watching the sunset.
Nice.
Or, and there was something that someone taught me the other day, is it's just even noticing when you do go into that autopilot. It's like, when you're walking from places, if instead of being inside your head, you're looking at what's around you, suddenly you walk a little bit slower and you're a little bit less, kind of stressed out. So I think that sometimes just taking that time to slow certain things down can be quite good.
So, and this kind of correlates with the soothing thing we were talking about this section for me. So the taking notice, in my opinion, we would do because we might be so focused about the thing we're worried about happening in the future. Or we might be ruminating about that exam we took yesterday where I think I did really rubbish and I just, can't get out of my head, and I compared it to like my mate and they sort of said this is what they said to that answer. We've all kind of been there in my opinion. Well, I've been there, where we've kind of compared ourselves and we're kind of beating ourselves up, about not having put something in an exam paper or having done an action that we don't feel so proud of, maybe, just generally speaking. So we can be really focused on ruminating about what's happened or worrying about the future. So we can find ourselves being so busy in our heads about either of those things. So the taking notice is about getting us into the present moment. And it's about not being judgmental about the present moment, because we're putting so much judgment on the future, on the past, don't we? But this is just about taking notice, and that might be that lovely leaf falling from the tree, or it might just be just being. So, that soothing bit is about being, not doing.
I think that's definitely something that we've tried to put forward in the Wellbeing book that the Wellbeing Ambassadors have put together.
Yeah,
subtle plug there. A little bit of a. Yeah, I think what I wanted to do with that was show that there is a lot of things that you can do, but you don't put that pressure on yourself to think that everything is going to work for you, because there might be certain things that you do, and it's like, come on, this is meant to make me feel better, but it doesn't, and that's okay that didn't work. but also give yourself that time to maybe try it more than once.
So the last two really quickly are keep learning. So if you kind of decide you want to learn something, I'm not talking about something for, college or anything, but something you've decided to learn, a new skill, that can give you a really good reward. So my example was crocheting. I only learned to do that a couple of years ago, and I really enjoy it. Not something I was ever going to learn, I'd be really honest, but it gives me a lot of nice feedback, actually. And I make kind of things for people in palliative care. And it gives me a really great sense of kind of a sense of achievement from that. Now, what happens if you get too stressed, it makes it really difficult to access that part of our brain to kind of do that learning. So it's important we kind of do that generally, and it's something that you enjoy. And it might be nice flow activity. I think you've talked about that in your booklet as well, haven't you? Yeah. So it might be worth to refer back to your booklet for that. So really important to sort of hold that in mind, because what that does is it gives us that reward, that feedback of something you've achieved, something that makes you feel good, because you've chosen to do it. It's not something that's enforced on you. So, and then the last one is about giving, being given. So it's giving something to somebody or an organisation. It might be that you're giving something back. So you're doing something that makes you feel good because you've done it for others. So I talked about I crochet blankets. I do that for people in palliative care. So that's one way I give back, and it makes me feel good. So they're just a few examples. Now, that's not always about one thing you do when you're really stressed, but it's just how you generally kind of different ways you can maintain your well-being. And what happens is if you do one of those things, it can have a domino effect on the others. So holding that in mind, just like it can the other way around. So if you let one of those things go because you're getting really stressed, it has a whole ripple effect, doesn't it? Like we talked about earlier. So it's a bit about kind of chaining it back a little bit.
So hopefully you've taken something from today's podcast, lots of really good advice in how to deal with stress and to understand what stress actually is. Don't forget to tune in to this series of podcasts on wellbeing at Framlingham College in Conversation. Thanks for listening.